And your wife, Sue, also raised concerns back in 2005 about some of those practices. Were her concerns taken seriously?
So this was the thing. Yes, Sue worked there in 2005 and was very troubled by what was going on. I remember her saying that she heard a colleague present a kid who'd gone off to have cross-sex hormones, and the kid had been seen on 4 occasions. And she said, that there hadn't been a sufficient psychological evaluation of what was going on with this kid. Many of the kids have got comorbid problems. They're neurodiverse. They've got family problems and histories of trauma. But her raising questions wasn't welcome, and this was very unusual within the trust. So we discussed it, and she decided to go to the medical director, raise her concerns with him. He was called David Taylor. This is in 2005. He did a thorough report. He got in a senior clinical psychiatrist from outside the trust who came in and took part in the investigation, and he raised concerns with the trust about the service. So the thing was that they were all the same concerns as being raised by David Bell and the parents in 2018, so 15 years later. So I'd heard it all before. And
it's incredible that with these serious concerns raised back then, we are where we are, and we are having kids, as you say, troubled with a variety of issues, being put down the path of medical intervention and transitioning. In a typical case, how many sessions will the child have before they are given something like hormone blockers or some sort of drug treatment?
Well, the thing is that the service varies.
Puberty blockers, I should say, not hormone blockers.
Puberty blockers, yeah. So the service vary. Some people, the clinicians would sort of listen to the child's presentation and then quite quickly move on to sort of come to the conclusion that they were trans, they needed to be assisted in their transition, and then they were sent for either puberty blockers or for cross-sex hormones, depending on their age. For other people in the team, they would take a much more sort of psychological approach, seeing them over a number of months or sometimes even years. But what the CQC, that's a governing body that sort of looks into the processes that go on in services, what they discovered was that there was no real protocols, there was no real model for thinking about these kids. It's one of the things I raised with the medical director, that you would think that psychotherapy and theories of human development and family dynamics would be very appropriate when thinking about kids who were at odds with themselves. But he told me that there was no particular approach being applied.
Well, that is troubling. It's potluck, which therapist you get that is just scary to have these children, and if they get someone who just recognises their self-ID and puts them on drug treatments straight away, that again is terrifying. Do you think we're going to see an avalanche of lawsuits from young adults who've been really damaged by this process? You're a psychotherapist. What percentage of these kids work out their issues in therapy and aren't really trans, though they may think they are in their teenage years?
The thing is, you've got to think about why. That you asked me the question, which I don't think I really answered, is why this has happened. The whole area has been politicised, and what you've got is sort of ideology interfering with normal clinical practice. So that in 2006, David Taylor said there needs to be much more research, much more outcome studies and debate about the approach. In 2018, I'm presented with basically a service that hasn't learnt the lessons from David Taylor's early report. what we did was that there was a meeting at the House of Lords in which a group of people, including myself, talked about this issue. I was surprised to learn that a lot of journalists were sort of ahead of the curve. They knew there was a serious problem here. And after that meeting, we thought, well, what do you do when there's a failure of medical authority? Because usually in medicine, you get a consensus, and then there are protocols about a recommended approach. But when the medical authorities have been captured by an ideology, which I believe is that's the case in relation to this issue, what do you do? Well, we turned to the courts, and my wife started the judicial review with a woman called Mother A, who had a 15-year-old child who was autistic. That was taken over by Kira Bell. Kira Bell was someone who'd been treated by the clinic, seen 4 times, had cross-sex hormones, and then a double mastectomy. And she had doubts and questions about whether the process had been... Now, the judges ruled that there was insufficient evidence.
Well, familiar with that case. Yeah, with Kira Bell's case is one we've certainly covered on this program, went all the way to the High Court in the UK, and I do really feel terribly sorry for what that poor young woman has suffered. Marcus Evans, thank you so much for joining me this evening. Appreciate it.